This is John Strong. You're listening to Soccer Made in Portland.
Welcome Timbers owner and president, Merritt Paulson.
This might take away your Merritt Paulson tweets segment.
No, we already did the Merritt Paulson Twitter update just to make sure we got it in. Garth Lagerway, Real Salt Lake general manager.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
An interview that we did with Kenny Cooper.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for the kind words.
Jim Rylett, he is the Timbers U23 coach.
For whatever reason, you have Kelly there because he's really not very good at what he does.
Opinions, yes. Factual information, that remains to be seen.
That's never stopped us before.
Good Tuesday morning, everybody. Sorry for the slightly late start. This is Soccer Made in Portland. Mao speaking with the full beard, and Kelly McLean, who has gone rogue, I think is the best way to say that, opposite me this morning. Kelly, how are you doing?
Quite well. I'm shaving my beard in stages. So next week, I'm going to go with the horseshoe down here. I'm just going to shave right there, and then I think maybe the week after that I'll just go with the straight porn stash for a week or so, and then maybe finish it all off after that. So just having a little fun on the wind down.
Yeah, I will not be following suit in that endeavor. I will be retaining the beard look probably until winter ends in June of 2013. So yeah, I'm back. Happy to be back, able to do the show not over the phone. Obviously, not much going on in the world of the Timbers this week. Just, 7 roster moves to talk about. So that's what we're going to talk about, obviously, today. Just a couple of details about the show, in case you're curious or as your first time listening. We are on the North American Soccer Network, NASN.TV, one of a number of shows covering MLS and all kinds of other soccer in various corners of the world, and so that's the site to go to for all of our archive shows, and from there you can access RSS links and iTunes, and those are the best places to subscribe to the show. You'll get the podcast as soon as it's available. You can also listen live on nasnradio.com through TuneIn or Stitcher, and that's going to be obviously live right now, but then will be replayed later in the week as well in case you missed it. So we have a lot of places to go with this. I mean, there's sort of different options for, do we want to talk about who's going out? Do we want to talk about who's coming in? Do we want to talk about homegrown player rights being transferred? But I thought it may be instructive to go with a quote from Gavin Wilkinson to start. And this kind of fits in with what we've talked about before on a number of occasions, even when people weren't necessarily believing it to be true. This pretty well describes exactly what Gavin Wilkinson thinks his job is as general manager. And we should say it doesn't necessarily matter who the coach is. At the moment, the coach is Caleb Porter. And so that colors what Gavin thinks and does and where he's looking and what he's seeking. But in the past, that has also been reflective of John Spencer's interests and desires. So here's the quote from Dan Eitel's most recent piece on MLS Soccer. The general manager's job is to get the pieces for the head coach to help the success of the organization, and it's about the organization. It's also about giving Caleb the pieces he wants to work with, the pieces he thinks will contribute the way he sees them contributing. Actually, I hadn't really read that all the way through. That's a really strange combination of words there from Gavin, but that's pretty much it. Gavin is the guy who retrieves the pieces that Caleb Porter wants. Sort of, that's his role. He's a facilitator, not necessarily. I guess I shouldn't say not a decision maker, but it's more about getting what Caleb wants than completely filling the conversation with his own ideas of what the team should or shouldn't do. So maybe that's a place to start. Maybe, what do you think about that, Kelly? And then we can transition that into who the Timbers did actually get, and then to clear the way, who they got rid of.
Well, I mean, we've talked about, this idea before, and just sort of the idea in general about sort of general managers, and no matter what team or what sport they're the general manager of, sort of what's that philosophy? Do you as a general manager just go out and get the best players that you can possibly get and then hand them over to the coach and say, here's what I've got for you, now make this work? Or do you go and work in conjunction with the coach and say, what players do you want, or what types of players do you want? And, I think in any sport, not just soccer, but basketball or football or whatever, I mean, you can see examples of both types of philosophies played out, and played out in some cases successfully and in some cases not successfully. But I think what we've known all along is that Paulson and, his strategy and what he's having Gavin do is support the coach. I think what they're trying to do is together hire a coach that they believe in, their philosophy and what they want to do wholeheartedly, everything that they want, and then just try to support that coach and get them the players and the types of players that he wants. And so, I mean, I think we obviously knew that already, with a lot of the moves that we've seen over the past couple of years. But I think Gavin now and in other recent comments, I think from Paulson, we've seen them sort of hinting towards that idea that, they're putting their faith in the coach. Now, maybe that didn't work out the first time through, but that was the decision that they made. That was what they felt was the best decision. They put their faith in the coach, and they're trying to support him, get the players and the types of players that he wants. Now they've made a change. So they've put their faith in a new coach and his system, and now they're trying to support him with the players and the types of players that he wants.
Yeah, so let's talk about those kinds of players. I think the most obvious one is Will Johnson, and a guy who's got some flexibility in position. The same is true of Harrington. We'll get back to him in a minute. But has played outside a little bit, can play inside for sure. He's only 25. He'll be 26 in January. But sort of just kind of changes the dynamic instantly of what's available in the midfield. Just a player who's a completely different type of player than the other guys who are currently on the roster. Now, how many of those guys will still be on the roster by the end of January, that remains to be seen, obviously. But, something that the Timbers have talked about, and Gavin in particular, is, we've got a lot of talent. We've got a lot of ability, but we don't necessarily have kind of grinders and guys who, they're skillful, but what really stands out with them is sort of their hard work, and they can go 90 minutes every week, and I think that's kind of where Will Johnson fits in. Obviously, he's part of the sort of the blow up that is, or the reboot, I guess, that is Salt Lake, and surely that's why he was available. And it sounds like he chose to go to Portland of a couple of trade options. So I'm curious, what do you think about Will Johnson? I mean, this is sort of the first opportunity we get, apart from sort of rumblings or rumors or whatever, to actually see, okay, this is a guy that the Timbers went out and got now that Caleb Porter is the manager, and very obviously his role as the decision maker or whatever is very clear, whereas before it was pretty murky during the second half of last season.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people would agree that it's a good pickup. It's a good acquisition. He's a different type of player than I think a lot of the other midfielders on the Timbers. If you think about guys like Songo and Sal Zizzo and Khalif, guys who have some flair, guys who like to take people on. I don't think Will Johnson's really that type of like 1v1 attacking type of player. He fit into that Salt Lake system very well, which was very well known, that they put the ball on the ground and knocked it around quite extensively. And that's, what we assume Caleb Porter would like to do. So it seems like, the perfect fit. It all sort of makes sense based on, what we know about Porter and Will Johnson and where they're coming from and what we've seen in the past. it seems like a good fit. And I think it's also interesting to note, and you alluded to this, that it sounds, what we've been told is that Will Johnson, had some options, and that, it was evident that Salt Lake was going to say, look, we're like you said, rebooting. You cost a bit more, and we're probably going to deal you. And what we've been told is that a number of teams were interested, and I think it's interesting to point out that that's easily a situation where a team could have bid one team against another to try to get the most possible for their player. And what we've been told is that Salt Lake said, hey, there's some interest out there. Where would you like to go? And I think there's a couple things to take away. First of all, it sounds like a real classy move from Salt Lake. And, I don't know that we would expect anything else. We've had Garth Lagerwey as a guest on our show. And I think, most people are impressed with the way Salt Lake has done things and the way they handle themselves generally. But I mean, that kind of says a lot that, they have a guy that they're clearly could have said to a number of different teams, well, hey, how much will you give us? And instead, they went to him and said, look, we've got some teams interested. Where would you like to go? The other interesting thing is that apparently Johnson said he wanted to go to Portland. And I think that's a piece of why they would want to go and hire a guy like Caleb Porter, because on some level, he's got some cachet to him. And it could be exactly for something like this, because somebody might say, well, hey, I know Portland's, I've played in Portland. It was against them, but I played there. They've obviously got a good crowd. And on top of it, Caleb Porter's their coach. I mean, you put a couple things together and players might now want to say, hey, that's a destination kind of place. I'd really like to go there. So, I mean, there's a couple of interesting little things that come out of that, but I think it should be a good fit. I think most people are excited about it.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting phenomenon to have less than 2 months after what was basically a catastrophic season, have people want to be traded to Portland. I mean, obviously the fan side of it, and I mean, at this point, every team has played in Portland at least once, if not several times, over the last 2 years, and so people are aware. They've played against the Timbers and in front of the Timbers Army and all that, and so that's sort of a natural draw, of course. But you would think that might be tempered a little bit by the performance of the team and knowing that there's a very significant reshuffling of roster and responsibilities and presumably coaching staff, maybe at least, but certainly at the top of that ladder. So yeah, that's sort of a side product to Caleb Porter coming to Portland that I guess I kind of knew that people would be interested in working with him, and not just his former players, which we'll get back to in a minute. But yeah, there's a recognition of a style, and even without having had his feet on the ground in Portland, permanently anyway. And that's seeping through already. So that's, I mean, from a fan perspective, that's fantastic. You want good players and interesting players to want to come here and sort of give Wilkinson and Porter some options of guys and not just getting whoever happens to be available. And that was, I guess, what I was a little bit afraid of going into this offseason. Not that they would make bad decisions, but you just can't get a bunch of great players in one offseason, especially when you were terrible last year, because it just doesn't really work out that way. So, to have a little bit of interest for whatever extra reason, that's good. The one question I have about Johnson has nothing to do with on the field, but at the moment, he would be the fourth highest paid player on the team. Obviously behind Boyd, which, again, he basically makes more than everybody else on the team combined. And then, Danny Mwanga and Donovan Ricketts both make a little bit more, Mwanga made significantly more, although not necessarily against the cap. So Johnson, I mean, I think it's a good move. I think he fits in well. I think he will be very well liked by the fan base. I think he will respond very well to being in a place like Portland. My question is, and we may not get an answer to it, but my question is he really going to make $243,000? And if so, is he supposed to be the fourth best or higher player on the team? And if so, that I think that changes the conversation a little bit. I still think it's a good move, and I suppose they could buy down part of his salary with allocation, and that's the kind of stuff that is going to be difficult to ascertain whether or not the Timbers have done that, or to what degree they've done that. But it is a significant financial investment, and that's not really been the case apart from Mwanga coming in. Actually, I suppose it's just Ricketts and Mwanga have been the two guys who've made quite a lot of money who have arrived via trade. And so that's something to think about. For example, he makes double what Michael Harrington makes. Now, I'm not saying it's not deserved. He's a significant player and a contributor to a good team and a regular starter and plays for Canada and been in the league 6 years. I mean, he's got the credentials, but that's still a lot of money for MLS. And you can do a lot with $243,000. So that's kind of my question about him as far as how that fits in. But obviously, I guess it kind of is obvious that there's more to come. So that may end up changing in some way. But I mentioned Harrington. We should talk about him. Obviously, this is another trade, and both of these trades were just straight allocation trades. This is very similar to the acquisitions of Sal Zizzo and Jack Jewsbury, who both were acquired just straight up for allocation money, no players involved. And Michael Harrington is a year older than Will Johnson, so he'll be 27 in January. But a guy again who kind of fits the bill a little bit with some flexibility. He's left-footed, but he's played both right and left back, and he got a little bit stuck in Kansas City behind Chance Myers and Seth Sinovic. So the kind of question is, did he regress, or did those guys overpass him? What's the deal with that? But his financial commitment for him is less. I mean, it's still high. It's higher than Rodney Wallace was making. He's at about $125,000. And at that level, I think you have to expect a guy like that to start, especially given the other absences that are now we now know, which we'll mention in a second. But yeah, so Michael Harrington, I mean, a guy who I think I would classify more than Will Johnson as a guy who was sort of available. I think Johnson was more of a special circumstance because of what Salt Lake is doing with their entire roster, whereas Harrington is more of a guy who got squeezed out in the rotation, and consequently Kansas City was more willing to part with him, and that made him available. So what do you think about Michael Harrington?
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know a ton. I mean, he was the third overall pick in the 2007 Super Draft. That year, he started 27 games. Next year, he started 30. In 2009, he started 17 times. In 2010, he started 29 times. And then sort of the bottom fell out as it looked like other guys were taking that role. 16 starts in 11 and 9 starts this past season. So, I mean, it sounds like a player who was pretty high on Kansas City's list, got a lot of minutes, got a lot of starts, and maybe just a victim of circumstance and a couple of guys who were just playing better than he was. So, yeah, I mean, I probably like a lot of people, especially given his, the amount he's played over the last couple of seasons, I'm not overly familiar with him, but it sounds like he's the type of guy that fits into what Porter wants to do. I have seen a couple of varying reports, though, about whether or not he's a left outside back or a right outside back, and which one he's better at, even though he's left-footed, apparently. So I guess that remains to be seen. Either way, I guess whichever one Porter wants is available for him. So I guess we'll find out. But, I mean, on the surface, yeah, I mean, it seems like a good pickup. And again, a guy who has experience, and a lot of experience over the past, 4 or 5 years.
Also has a lot of experience playing with Jack Jewsbury, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, but there is a little bit of an overlap there. They played together for 4 years. I think, Harrington is sort of one of these pieces that we're going to look back and say, actually, we can already look at it and say, yeah, the biggest thing they wanted to do was change the defense, and not just improve the defense as far as defending, but improve what players can do getting the ball out of defense. We'll see once Porter arrives whether or to what degree he sort of implements this style of, it was described like, as 2 center backs and 8 midfielders, at Akron. And I don't think we're going to see that exactly at the Timbers, but, that's sort of the idea on some level. So having a guy like Harrington who can be on either side is pretty good on the ball. Even if he's only a slight upgrade, I guess I hesitate to use that word too often, but even if he's a slight upgrade defensively, if he's a much more involved player offensively, that kind of fits into the again supposed Porter system that we're expecting. But I think his arrival, that was reported on Sunday night and really kind of signaled, like I said, that the defense is the focus. And if you look at the guys who went out yesterday, Kimura via trade, Bruner via trade, Smith via sort of not coming back, Palmer and Purdy via contracts options being declined, Wallace, if that ends up remaining the way it is now, being a guy with a contract option declined. I mean, what do those guys all have in common? They all were defenders for the Timbers, and it basically leaves some really young guys and David Horst and Anya Mascara in defense. I mean, and I think we all assume Fudi Dansu is going to be on his way out at some point via some means or another between now and when 2013 starts. So it's very obvious that defense is the key, which is a little bit of an interesting perspective with Porter, because I think everybody talks about, it's about possession and ball control and, death by 1,000 passes and all these kinds of things. But, it's really important to have defenders who can actually facilitate that kind of attack or augment it or help it along. That's something the Timbers didn't really have. I mean, the Timbers defenders who played well were fine, but they weren't necessarily the kind that Porter would be able to take and just stick right into the system to move the ball from on the ground, from the back, through the middle, and go from there. And that's what I think we're going to see. So yes, we see Harrington, and he's going to be an outside guy. Whether he ends up on the left or the right, it almost doesn't matter as far as kind of the bigger picture, because they're gonna be making some moves. They're gonna be changing the face of the defense, and it seems like they're going to be doing that first. And that, I think, is surprising to me. I just thought what we'd see is a little bit of a shift in the midfielders or some kind of indication of what kinds of players Porter wants who go forward. But it never really occurred to me that he may want to just clean house in the defense and start from there. I don't know. That never really crossed my mind.
Well, I think the defense right now is interesting. I'm not so convinced anymore that Footy will be gone now, and obviously that's just because it's Bruner that's now gone. But it would seem to me as though, you've got Mosquera and Horst as presumably your starting center backs. You've got the next generation, the up-and-comer, Jean-Baptiste. But then, you kind of need another guy who's there and available. And maybe that's just going to be Footy. Maybe they decided that Bruner wouldn't accept a role like that, but that Footy might. maybe if Porter's going to prioritize playing Mosquera and Horst, and then whenever possible, get Jean-Baptiste minutes to get him coming along as a player, maybe that puts one other center back, sort of outside the circle. And maybe they just figured that Brunner wouldn't, accept that kind of role, but that Footy might. I mean, I don't know. I was really surprised, that Brunner was the guy gone and Footy stayed, because, I sort of rate Brunner higher than Footy. So I assume they would have, done something with him. It's kind of interesting. I suppose there's also a question mark in there of if you feel like those three guys are enough, Mosquera, Jean-Baptiste, and Horst, maybe you do get rid of Footy, and maybe you keep, maybe you view Kowalik as a guy who played center back all through college, as a guy who can fill in when necessary. I don't know what their plans are there, but it is sort of interesting that they've really cleaned house defensively, and that they may not be done. I mean, is Taylor going to still be around? Is Footy still going to be around? I mean, those are big question marks. I mean, those guys could be gone, and then you could have two less defenders, and going to fill in with even more players. So, I guess we'll have to wait to see. But pretty intriguing so far, the moves that have been made defensively, particularly trading Brunner.
Yeah, and I guess I look at the Brunner deal a little bit differently. I think of the guys who aren't the guys they've picked to be the sort of standard bearers, so Mosquera and Horst, and obviously they've got a commitment with Jean-Baptiste being a high draft pick, Generation Adidas. I mean, that I don't think anybody's got a problem with that. But Brunner's got the most value. I mean, Brunner, if you were going to move somebody via trade, Steve Purdy isn't back with the Timbers and wasn't traded because he has no value. Right. Nobody's going to trade something for Steve Purdy. They know if he doesn't get picked back up by the Timbers, if someone actually wants him, they can get him either in re-entry or bring him into camp or whatever. Eric Brunner is too good to fall into that role, and I think he's got a level of respect just sort of as a competitor and a guy who, he played basically every game last year. He would have, I think, this year had he not had the concussion and the sort of resulting issues from that. So, it's definitely disappointing. I think a lot of people like Eric Brunner and thought he did well for the Timbers and were disappointed that he was injured and wasn't able to play more. But if you've decided that you like Horst, and that's kind of what it came down to, that they basically had to make a decision on whether they like Brunner or they like Horst, and they liked Horst, obviously, because they traded Brunner. But you can get a return for Brunner. He's not old. He's well respected. He can slot in, and I actually think he is a guy who would be willing to be a sub if it meant being part of a good team, or if that's just the role he has to take right now, whether that was in Portland or Houston. So I think he's, I think it's sad on some level from a fan perspective, but I think he's the guy you had to trade. I mean, I don't know that anybody's trading for Footy or giving you enough in return to make it worthwhile. So I tend to lean that way. And then that actually kind of leads us into the Kimura trade. No surprise Kimura's not back. I don't think he particularly enjoyed his time in Portland. Obviously, the last John Spencer move to come in, went on trial in Poland. That didn't work out. He seems to be out of contract at the end of this year. So in some ways, it's kind of nice that the Timbers got anything for him. I think it's somehow wrapped in with the Kenny Cooper deal. Obviously, we know the Timbers waived the fee that New York would have to pay if they re-signed Kenny Cooper, which that is a web and that we could get into and never get out. Trying to understand that, but the key, the reason I wanted to mention it is this Bryan Gallego guy who's just, I guess he's still in his sophomore year, but just finished his second season at Akron. And he's a center back. Obviously, Caleb Porter knows him. The Timbers got his homegrown player rights from New York. And so they basically have right of first refusal for signing him. And, I tried to ask a couple of people who follow college soccer, Travis Clark in particular, who we had on right after the Timbers hired Porter. And Travis made it pretty clear he expects Gallego to leave school after this year. So that would mean like tomorrow,
Right.
because he would, be able to. I mean, if the Timbers wanted to sign him as a homegrown player, they could. I think, and he is a guy who would sort of be like a Jean-Baptiste type guy in terms of relative age and experience, and on a salary that wouldn't count against the salary cap. So, that's another thing to kind of consider, that, yeah, you could try and move Ryan Kowalik in there. He doesn't make very much money, and it doesn't matter anyway because he's on that list of the non-senior players. But why not get a guy who's already familiar with Porter? Obviously, this is a move that is a direct Porter move, to acquire this kid who the rights, his homegrown rights. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of things. And because of Porter's connections with college and so many Akron players, and kind of in the lead up to the draft, I wouldn't be surprised if we see something else similar to that. But I think that we're going to see. Well, I guess I should say I hope that what we'll see is kind of a stocking of the team with some younger talented guys. I know there's sort of an expectation of improving in 2013 relative to 2012. But if Caleb Porter's your guy, I mean, you don't hire a guy who's under 40 to fire him in 2 years. So, presumably the plan is to have a little bit of a longer view. And if that means you've got to trade a guy who could play now and who's popular here, like Bruner, in order to free up, to get some money and then to free up some space for a guy who might be able to play in 2 years or 3 years and be just as good, if not better. Mm-hmm. I think they've got to take the long view, and I think this is the first move that we really see in that vein. We've kind of talked about the possibility that would be going on, and but also debating, how much they need to win in 2013. Picking up homegrown rights for a 19-year-old and trading a guy who was only in Portland for like 3 months, to me, is brilliant. That's how you're supposed to do it. You get something for a guy you maybe expected that you might not get anything for, and you get a guy who you don't have to sign him this year, or you could, depending on how things go. And I think that flexibility is not on-field flexibility, but just sort of roster flexibility, salary cap flexibility, shows either that Gavin knows more about what he's talking about than people give him credit for, or Porter's already figured it out with kind of how to work that MLS roster system.
Well, let's take a little detour here. I mean, we've got lots of other things to talk about, particularly along the defensive line. But let's take a little detour here, because this is fascinating. I don't think, to anybody's knowledge at least, homegrown rights had ever been traded. I mean, this is I think when that news came out, many people were asking, wait, what, you can trade the homegrown rights to players? Did we even know this? Did we even know that this was possible? And if you go back, a year ago, I'm not sure anybody had made deals to protect themselves from expansion drafts the way that Gavin did with Ryan Poor in Montreal. Again, it was the same kind of thing. That news sort of leaked out, and people sort of said, oh, okay, I guess you could go and make a deal to not have anybody selected in an expansion draft. I mean, these are some pretty intriguing moves that the Timbers and Gavin Wilkinson have made. And I mean, especially this homegrown rights one, I see that as something that could change a ton of deals in the future down the road. If it wasn't something that people had planned on or really even thought about, that you have, sort of these commodities down in your youth system, and you can use those to barter and trade. I mean, that's just value now that maybe sort of appears out of nothing, that maybe you didn't know you really had, and now all of a sudden maybe you've got some value. That's pretty interesting. I mean, it brings up some other questions though about, to what extent do do those players have to agree to such a move? I mean, there's some other things to be brought up there, but I'm pretty intrigued by that whole notion and that idea. And I mean, pretty incredible that Gavin went out and made that move. And yeah, I think a lot of people think that was a brilliant move, and the Timbers, obviously got the most out of that that they could, and definitely got the better end over New York on that.
Yeah, for sure. And there's sort of been an understanding that if you traded a guy who was a homegrown player, now this is after they're already in the first team, so a guy like Juan Agudelo or something, that they continue to be exempt from the salary cap, even if they're no longer with the club for whom they were originally a homegrown player. So that I think maybe logic has nothing to do with it, but logically that would maybe say to me, okay, so Gallego, even though he has never played in the Timbers Academy and never will because he's already in college, would still count as an exempt player. And that's the key. I mean, part of it is the development aspect, but if you're trading for a guy who's never going to play in your academy, it isn't about development. It's about cap space and cap flexibility, and it's fantastic. I can't say enough how much I think that move is smart. And even if it doesn't really lead to anything, even if Gallego ends up being a bust or gets hurt or something, which I don't want that to happen, but if it did, it's still a smart move to make. That's the kind of sort of hedging move that you should be making if it's available. I mean, it's kind of like baseball. Like, you can trade prospects who are not at the team in the big club, and they just get transferred over, and you can call them straight up if you want, or not. You can wait, and it's just kind of a luxury to have the option to use or not. So yeah, I think that's fantastic. And a little bit, I think, because of the clamor among fans was, I think people are excited to see Johnson and Harrington, especially Johnson, after he kind of went on a Twitter parade of just saying how excited he was to be in Portland, and people love that, and I don't doubt that it's sincere. But I think what people really wanted to have happen yesterday was to trade every single player on the team. And so I think that what people really wanted was sort of a cavalcade of exits, and not even necessarily as interested in who's coming in. And I think that half step below is a guy who isn't. The Timbers aren't announcing this guy as Bryan Gallego as a guy on their team. He's not on the team. So that's kind of even a little bit further from the sort of consciousness of people who just wanted to see certain guys leave. So I think it's, even though it threw up a lot of I don't know about red flags, but it made a lot of people question what was going on around the league. I think Portland is the one place where nobody cared, where people weren't asking questions. Wait, how did we pull this off? How is this even? Was this a rule? People were just like, oh, this is the guy who might come here, but as a result of Kimura leaving, and it sort of is in the back end of the conversation. Whereas I think other people were looking at it as, oh, that's sort of the story of this deal. That I think it just slips through a little bit here. Let's make sure we talk about Stephen Smith and Rodney Wallace. I think Palmer and Purdy are pretty straightforward. They had contract options. Oh, go ahead.
Let me do this first, just because you mentioned hiring Porter, and there's sort of a long-term view there. We've got a ridiculous comment in the chat box that I've just got to put out there. Somebody said, you mentioned Porter and you don't plan on firing him. You look to the long term. Somebody says you do plan to fire him in 2 years if you're Gavin Wilkinson and you want the head coaching job for yourself. This is completely ridiculous, people. I don't know how many times you have to hear it. Gavin Wilkinson does not want to be the coach. He is not manipulating things so that he can end up as the head coach someday. This is ridiculous. Quit saying that. He doesn't want it. He's said it. Merritt has said it. It's this conspiracy theory that comes from this Gavin Wilkinson hate that's just completely out of line and out of context and is ridiculous. So just stop saying it. It doesn't make any sense at all and doesn't follow the things that have happened. Even though he was interim head coach for a period, it doesn't follow that he wants to be head coach. So we'll just get that out of the way and done. So let's move on to the rest of our defenders.
You look so much meaner with that goatee when you're... okay, Palmer, Purdy, that's easy. I don't think there's a reason to bring Purdy back. Lots of reasons not to bring Palmer back. So those guys are not having their contracts picked up. That makes sense. Rodney Wallace is a little bit of a more interesting case. Officially, his contract option was also declined. So if nothing happens between now, or if nothing changes between now and Thursday afternoon, which is the deadline for the reentry draft, or sort of the deadline for new deals to be negotiated, he will also exit the club at that point. So what we've heard is that the Timbers are negotiating with him for a new deal. I think it's sort of understood that means less money, because that's kind of that's the hang up. I mean, I think if Rodney Wallace was making $44,000 a year like Steve Purdy was, I think there would be no problem keeping him in the team as kind of a squad player and a guy who can play as a back or as a midfielder if you need. But he made $110,000 against the cap last year, and for a guy who you're not. I mean, they gave him every possibility. They played him at left back. They played him at left midfield. They played him in central midfield. I mean, if they'd played 5 more games, they probably would have had him at goalkeeper. They've seen what they want from him. It's obvious that he doesn't factor in the major plans for the team. However, I do think they'd like to have the flexibility of keeping him if he'd be willing to accept a lower number. So that, I think it's, I mean, my opinion, it's going to come down to whether Rodney wants to stay in Portland or not. If he wants more money, I don't think he's going to get 110 anywhere else. I think that's a holdover from being a Generation Adidas guy a few years ago. I don't think he's going to get that somewhere else as a guy who's not a sort of regular starter necessarily. But he might be able to do more than what the Timbers could offer him or would be willing to offer him. I'm not sure. I don't know what the numbers are, but so I think that'll just come down to how much he likes living and playing in Portland. And so, I mean, if it was me, I'd want to stay. But I can also understand he's only 24. There's no reason, if you drop down significantly in salary, it takes a lot to go back up. And, do you really want to drop down that far when you're only 24? I'm not sure he'll want to do that. So that's kind of an interesting one. We'll know by Thursday afternoon whether they've reached an agreement and he will stay, or if he's turned down whatever offers they might be making and sort of testing the waters, if you will.
Yeah, and that's always been the issue with Rodney Wallace, is just how much money he makes. At least that's always been the most compelling factor. And yeah, you can talk about how well he played defense or how well he played outside mid, but with Rodney, it's always been the most compelling factor has been the amount of money he makes. So it's just going to come down to, like you said, how much are the Timbers offering, and is he willing to accept that, or does he think he's worth more to somebody else? And I think most people wouldn't mind having Rodney on the team as long as he's getting minutes as more of a winger and an outside midfielder and less as an outside back. But he still is that option, that player that can be a backup if things go horribly wrong, if your starter goes down and then whoever you want to have as your second player there goes down as well, or somebody gets a red card, is ejected from one game, and then another guy gets hurt. If Wallace is kind of your third choice at a left back somewhere, that's totally fine, and that gives you that flexibility a little bit. So, but I think most people would rather see him playing in the midfield, which is crowded already and could be even more crowded. I'm sure, we'll be able to talk about that more probably in the coming weeks, as maybe this is the week for moves with defenders, and maybe next week we'll see some stuff with midfielders. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to see Rodney stick around, but it's just going to come down to whether or not they can agree on what he's worth.
Yeah, and speaking of value or worth, I think it's fair to say that Stephen Smith was going to be too expensive for what the Timbers wanted in 2013, and he sort of admitted or said goodbye to Portland, from already being in Scotland to Timbers fans, and thanked everybody. Merritt Paulson included him in his sort of like, it's really hard to say goodbye to people that you like tweet, and he was on there. So even though there hasn't been an official announcement yet, I think it's not unreasonable to expect that he, in fact, will not be with the Timbers next year due to some kind of contract situation. But regardless, that takes away your starting. I mean, we'll just, for the sake of argument, assume Wallace doesn't come back for a minute. That means that all of the people that you had starting at left back at some point this year, Chabala, Wallace, Smith, they'll all be gone. And everybody you had starting at right back, apart from Jewsbury, which would be Palmer, Purdy, and Kimura, they're all gone. And so, it like I said earlier, it's sort of the even if the Timbers would have liked to bring Stephen Smith back, I mean, if it's cost prohibitive, you have to make a decision, and I can understand that. But it's like, where do the Timbers need to improve most? They're left and right back. Well, they've eliminated 6 players basically. At this moment, there are 6 players who are not under contract for 2013 who started those games. And if you want to make it even more ridiculous, Freddie Braun played some right back, and he's gone too. So basically only Jewsbury remains of people who played there, and everybody knows that wasn't. Even though he did reasonably well, that's not kind of what you want necessarily to have Jewsbury back there. So it is the area where, I mean, yes, Chris Taylor is still on the roster. I don't know if he will be or not by January. Yes, Kowalik is still on the roster. I expect he probably will be. But those guys are not important to. I mean, no offense to them, but they're not important parts of the team. I mean, those guys didn't play. Chris Taylor hasn't played at all. I mean, in fairness, he was hurt some, but that's not what we're talking about here. So this is the total reboot on the defense. Lose a little bit of depth at center back. Presumably we'll replace it with something, but that's the focus, and there's people should be happy about that, because that's what everybody wanted. That's what every single person, that nobody said the most important thing that the Timbers need to change is forward or midfield. Nobody said that. Everybody said outside backs. It doesn't even matter which side you start first, or where you begin first. It doesn't. Just do one of them, please. And that is something that is being instantly addressed. Now, there will be time for complaint, and questioning later when more than just one guy comes back in, because that is the other half of the equation, of course. But this is what people were asking for. So it's kind of interesting that it doesn't always work that way. You don't always. I mean, I think Portland fans would be pretty familiar with this scenario where you want something and it doesn't happen. This is a scenario where that's what people wanted, and it's the first thing addressed.
Yeah, and it's something that's honestly needed to be addressed for a while. I mean, that's always sort of been the hot spot for change. I'm disappointed, to see Stephen Smith go. He got off to a rough start, but I really liked the way he played at the end of the season, the last 2 or 3 months. I thought he was very good. He took some time adjusting, as we always hear that players take time adjusting, not just to a new team, but to a new country, a new league. That's always difficult. But I think, if you had said come March 2nd, 2013, Stephen Smith will be your starting left back, I think I totally would have been fine with that. I wouldn't have had any problem with that at all. So I'm kind of disappointed, I think, to see him go. But curious to see what fills his spot and what comes in behind him.
And it's also curious to me anyway, to wonder, does this have any impact on Chris Boyd? Does this have? I'm certain. Well, I shouldn't say I'm certain. I feel confident that that the decision wasn't made as a prelude to a decision on Boyd. I think this is a decision made independent of anybody else, just dealing one-on-one with Stephen Smith and his contract and whatever demands or expectations that were going to be coming for 2013 and their overall plan for how they want to allocate their money position-wise and across a number of players. But, Stephen Smith is Chris Boyd's only friend, at the Timbers. I mean, really. So, does that make Boyd all of a sudden? I mean, surely he knew that this was a possibility that Smith might not come back, even though Boyd had a 2-year contract a 2-year guaranteed contract that Smith didn't, and that this would be something that would have to be considered anyway, at least by this time of the year. So, I mean, obviously a surprise, no, if you're Boyd, but it does change, the kind of equation of living here for another year. And, I think everybody has their own opinion on whether or not he fits or he can fit, or if it's worth it to try and buy him out or not, or trade him. Does anybody want the salary? No, but would anybody be willing to take some of it on? Would Portland be willing to take some of it on or not? I mean, there's a million different ways to look at it, but I think it's sort of interesting to now we know Smith, isn't going to be back. Does that have any impact on Boyd's decision or not? It may not. He may be totally independent. He is under contract for 2013. So, if everything else breaks down, he'll be here because he will have to be here or not play unless he's moved because he's under contract here. So, I think things like that are it's lame to say more is coming in the future because, well, yeah, there's always going to be something different and changing in the future, no matter how far of a view you take. But, there's going to be more moves. The Timbers are not done. Just as, we heard people kind of complaining about when they made the cuts last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever that was, when Hogg and Rinkin and Braun were dropped, and people said, how could you possibly make roster cuts and not cut Lavelle Palmer? Well, it's because that's not the only mechanism for doing so. And so I think we're kind of expecting to hear more, not necessarily today, maybe, but, as this week goes on and next week before January, because, all of a sudden then you're like 2 weeks from training camp once you get past Christmas when everybody will be off. And I don't expect a lot to happen sort of at the end of the month. And then you're coming up on training camp, so you got to get some moves done. The draft is coming up then, so there's a lot obviously to come. But it's nice from a sort of macro perspective to finally see the moves made, some of which we expected, some of which we didn't. But now we can actually formulate an educated guess or an educated conversation about Caleb Porter instead of this mythical, wizard who just directs 8 midfielders to score 27 goals in a game. And obviously that's nonsense, but what was there to go on? He hasn't said anything. Nobody's met him. Nobody outside of the organization's met him up here. And, it's nice to finally see the sort of a little peek into what kind of mindset he's bringing as far as player acquisition.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see what that's going to mean for our long line of forwards and midfielders and how that's going to work out. So I think maybe we can, in the coming weeks, have those discussions, take a look at the midfield line and the forward line and go through those players and what changes might be made in the near future or what could be made. A couple other things we should touch on real quickly here with about 5 or 6 minutes to go. We did get details of the preseason tournament that will be held at Geldwin Field. And then we do need to do a little recap of fantasy because I had a blast at the end of fantasy there. I just had so much fun.
Let's hit that first. because I was pulling my hair out because I had Robbie Keane as the only player on my team playing in the final, and he had 2 goals called off. And obviously they were both well, the first one, the offside goal he was definitely off. He was offside twice in the same play, or two different off of 2 different passes, so that was fine. The other one, was an Omar Gonzalez sort of over the back foul, and Keane had a pretty spectacular goal called off. He did get the penalty at the end, but so I was going crazy because first of all, I knew I was going to be writing something about him, and so I wanted a goal to at least be part of the story, and that was making me go insane. But that was my only option was points from Robbie Keane, and I knew I wasn't going to be alone in that. So consequently, I ended up basically where I'd been in the upper 20s, 28 for most of the sort of last couple of months of the season. So I don't feel too bad about that, but I was going crazy every time Robbie Keane scored, and then it got called back because I was just counting the fantasy points and starting to write my article already, and then no. But he did get the penalty at the end. That was nice.
Well, I moved up 1 spot, so I finished in the top 20. I finished 19th, so I was pretty happy with that, especially considering I had predicted myself for virtually a last place finish and spent much of the first couple of months on the second page. And Trevor, with a full 0 points, managed to remain on the front page, finished in 46th. And first place overall, MD 88 Keys, Matt Durkoop wins it all, and I think he was in first place, I think probably wire to wire in that thing. So congratulations, and thanks to everybody for joining in on fantasy, and I think we'll just plan on doing another league again next year, and so that I can continue to have things to talk about.
Absolutely, we will. So yeah, let's hit this tournament real quick in our last few minutes. It's basically the same tournament as last year. The change out is Chivas out and Dallas in, which I think makes for a little bit more compelling tournament. Chivas was okay. They're actually okay in the tournament last year, despite being generally terrible against everyone except the Timbers during the season. But I think Dallas brings, the Breck Shea will be up here, and there's just a little more, of an interest from a neutral perspective, I guess. But AIK comes back from Sweden, which makes me very happy because I covered them last year, and super nice folks and a pretty interesting team. They've been in the Europa League this year, playing against Napoli and stuff like that. So they're going to be coming in ahead of their season. And then San Jose will be back, which, that's a little bit of a different perspective than when they came here in February of 2012. They looked very good in the preseason tournament. I'm not sure anybody in their right mind would have said this team will win the Supporters' Shield. But, there they were. So that's kind of a star-studded look anyway. At least with Wondolowski, the MVP, the Golden Boot winner, all-time, tied for the record, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, Sunday, February 17th, Portland will play San Jose. Wednesday, February 20th, Portland will play Dallas. And then Saturday, February 23rd, Portland will play AIK. And then it's only a week. It's the following Saturday that MLS First Kick takes place, March 2nd. Whether or not the Timbers will play on March 2nd, we don't yet know. They could play a few days before or a few days after. Remember, the Timbers didn't play until the Monday in the 2012 season opening weekend. So, but yeah, good to know the details. We now know all of the scheduled games, and it's interesting. The Timbers play, apart from AIK and FC Tucson, the Timbers play Colorado, Seattle, San Jose, and Dallas, and then also Kansas City. Among those teams. So heavy against the Western Conference, which makes sense. You want to get a look at them, get some experience and time in against teams you're going to play 3 times. So, pieces are starting to fall into place. We only have about 30 seconds left, so we're going to have to leave it at that. But we expect at least to hear a little bit more about who has been re-signed for 2013 and who was already under contract, things like that at some point. Probably within the next week, so we will pass that along when we get it. If not, just talk about it on next week's show. So, we'll be back on Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific here on the North American Soccer Network. And until then, this is Mal.
And this is Kelly. We'll see you again next week.
Yeah, speak to you then.